Some killers make headlines by the dozens they leave behind, others by the brutality of what they do to their victims, and a few, disturbingly, by how well they blend in with the rest of us. This is not a script about madness in the abstract. This is about the method, the step-by-step, routine evil executed by people who didn't wear masks or hide in the shadows, but instead moved through grocery stores, salons, gas stations, and quiet suburbs like nothing was wrong. This compilation dives into 5 of the most ruthless, calculated serial killers in American history. Names that didn't always make the national news, but whose crimes carved through towns like a slow-moving plague. They didn't kill for passion or out of psychosis alone. They killed because it worked, because it made them feel in control, because no one stopped them in time. Over the course of this investigation, you'll walk through the wreckage left behind by a compulsive spender turned killer, a manipulator who lured laborers into shallow graves, a political extremist who used bullets instead of words, a real estate agent with bodies buried under his listings, and a highway drifter who vanished men like they were never there. These aren't cautionary tales. These are cold-blooded blueprints. Meticulous, real, and still echoing in court records and police archives. And it begins not with a man in the shadows, but with a woman who murdered quietly between errands. Dana Sue Gray, the killer who went shopping with blood on her hands. Southern California in 1994 looked like any other suburban pocket of America, filled with gated communities, manicured hedges, and the illusion of safety. Canyon Lake was a retirement-friendly zone where most neighbors waved, left their doors unlocked, and rarely imagined they could be targeted in broad daylight. That illusion died the day Norma Davis was found, 86 years old, stabbed multiple times, strangled, slumped near her sofa. No sign of forced entry, nothing stolen, no indication of sexual assault or burglary, just violence, sudden, clinical, and cold. The kind that doesn't fit a clear motive. Detectives at first wondered if it was personal, but Norma had no enemies. Her life was uneventful, her schedule predictable. And then, weeks later, another woman died. 66-year-old June Roberts was found dead in her home, strangled with a telephone cord. This time, there was a theft, her credit cards. But within hours, those cards were used at local shops, salons, and department stores. And the surveillance footage didn't show a panicked teenager or a masked intruder. It showed a calm woman, middle-aged, walking the aisles with confidence, trying on clothes, smiling. Dana Sue Gray. Her appearance didn't match the crime. She had once been a nurse's assistant, polite, familiar to the neighborhood. But beneath that quiet surface, she was unraveling. Following her mother's death, Dana spiraled into a compulsive shopping addiction. Creditors were after her. Her relationship was falling apart. Her bank account was drained. She didn't just want money, she needed it. And quickly. And in her fractured logic, the quickest way to get it was to take it. But Dana didn't rob banks or scam insurance companies. She identified elderly women, many of whom had connections to her deceased mother. She used those weak social ties to gain access to their homes. Once inside, she attacked with whatever was nearby, a lamp, a cord, her bare hands. And after the killing, she didn't run. She drove straight to the store and started buying clothes, haircuts, beauty products, groceries. She used the victim's credit cards within hours, sometimes even minutes. Investigators were slow to piece it all together, not because she was a master criminal, but because the idea of a middle-aged woman killing to go shopping was unthinkable. But the paper trail began to speak. Dana wasn't cautious. She left receipts, appeared in surveillance footage, and even used the stolen cards at places she'd previously visited under her real name. One investigator later said, "It was like she didn't care if she got caught. The shopping was worth it." That's what separated Dana from other killers. She wasn't angry, she wasn't erratic, she was indifferent. When arrested, she was calm. When questioned, she was clinical. She admitted what she'd done with no remorse, said the shopping made her feel better, That killing was just the price of relief. She described the murders the way someone might describe a long commute: unpleasant, necessary, forgettable. Dana's home, when searched, was full of the evidence. Clothes still in shopping bags, cosmetics unopened, hair salon appointment cards, none of it hidden. It was all proudly stacked like trophies. Only these weren't mementos of the kill. They were the reward. She didn't keep jewelry or photos from the victims. She kept the stuff she bought after they died. Her trial moved quickly. She pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and received life without parole. But the haunting question remained: how many more might she have killed if she hadn't been caught by a survivor? One of her victims had fought back, managed to escape, and described her to police. That was the beginning of the end. Dana Sue Gray is now serving her sentence in the Central California Women's Facility, but her case remains a chilling reminder that not all killers look the part. Some kill between errands. Some kill and then go buy lipstick. And in a world where we measure danger by how it looks, Dana reminded us that sometimes the real threat is smiling in the checkout line behind you. Once the arrest was made and the pieces began to settle, investigators turned their focus to understanding the scale of Dana Sue Gray's crimes. It wasn't just the 3 confirmed murders that concerned them. It was how easily those murders had been carried out and how little resistance she had encountered while committing them. Canyon Lake had been chosen not for any strategic advantage, but because it was familiar, quiet, and filled with older residents who often lived alone. The neighborhood was meant to be secure, a walled-in retirement sanctuary, and that illusion had lulled everyone into a dangerous sense of comfort. Gray didn't need to break in. She didn't need to threaten her way into anyone's home. She relied entirely on social engineering, small talk, recognition, a smile, and the presumption that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly be a threat. She had no criminal record beyond a few minor financial mishaps. She didn't raise alarms in public. There was nothing about her presence that suggested predatory intent. But once the door was closed behind her and she was inside those homes, the transformation was instant. Her weapon was often whatever she could find nearby: a heavy object, a kitchen knife, a cord. She killed quickly, with no signs of prolonged struggle, and once the victim was dead, she'd move immediately to ransack purses, drawers, and nightstands, searching for credit cards, pins, and any form of usable identification. Then she'd clean up just enough to walk out unnoticed and drive directly to the nearest store. Surveillance footage became the linchpin in the case. Investigators cross-referenced timestamps on store receipts with the last known moments of each victim's life. What they discovered was a disturbing timeline. Gray often went shopping within 30 minutes of the murder. She would try on clothes, smile at clerks, pay with the victim's card, and even ask about return policies. Her purchases weren't driven by need. They were impulsive, excessive, and designed to fill a psychological void. She wasn't buying essentials. She was buying silk blouses, hair dye, makeup kits, and scented candles. One receipt showed a purchase of over $400 made less than 2 hours after a murder. The footage from that day showed her posing in front of a mirror, adjusting her hair, and laughing with a store associate. When detectives showed that footage to the families of the victims, the reactions weren't just grief, they were disbelief. How could someone move so seamlessly from murder to retail therapy? How could someone kill, wipe the sweat from their forehead, and then casually shop for nail polish and accessories? The answer, according to forensic psychologists, lay in Gray's emotional detachment and compulsive disorder. Dana wasn't psychotic in the traditional sense. She didn't suffer from hallucinations or delusions. She knew exactly what she was doing. She planned it, she executed it, and she enjoyed the aftermath, not because of the kill itself, but because of the freedom it gave her, the momentary euphoria of unchecked spending. Her motive wasn't rage or revenge. It was the rush of acquisition, the addictive dopamine hit of consumerism. The murders were not the thrill, they were the price of admission. One of the more disturbing elements discovered during the investigation was a pattern in the post-murder purchases. Gray often bought similar items after each killing: clothing in her size, specific brands of makeup, and perfume. Detectives believed these patterns were not random. They were part of a psychological loop, a ritual she repeated to maintain a sense of control and identity. After each murder, she was resetting herself, reinforcing a self-image that was outwardly glamorous and composed, even if internally fractured. The murder scenes were examined with increasing detail. In each case, Gray had shown signs of calm efficiency. There were no indications of frenzy. She didn't ransack the houses. She didn't destroy property unnecessarily. She took only what she needed, primarily financial instruments and sometimes jewelry, if it could be easily pawned or used. But her primary target was always the credit cards. She often signed receipts in her own handwriting, made no attempt to conceal her face from security cameras, and drove the same car to each location. Her confidence bordered on recklessness, but it also pointed to a terrifying truth. She didn't believe she'd be suspected, and for a while, she wasn't. The cases remained separate until a surviving victim came forward. That woman, whose name was withheld for privacy, had invited Gray into her home under the impression they knew each other through family. Within minutes, Gray attacked, attempting to strangle her with a telephone cord. But the victim fought back, breaking free and calling for help. Gray fled the scene, but the damage was done. A police sketch was made, tips began to flood in, and Gray, unaware she had been identified, continued her spending spree until the day of her arrest. When officers entered her home, they found it to be less a residence and more a gallery of unearned wealth. Dozens of shopping bags lined the floor. Receipts, cosmetics, handbags, and unopened boxes of clothing filled entire rooms. She lived alone at the time, and there was no indication she planned to stop. If anything, she was accelerating. Detectives suspected there were more planned killings in the pipeline, and the surviving victim had unknowingly stopped a sequence that might have extended far beyond Canyon Lake. In interviews with mental health professionals, Gray displayed no remorse. She described the murders as unpleasant but necessary. She claimed the shopping made her feel like herself again, that it helped her cope with the grief of losing her mother and the humiliation of financial collapse. She viewed her victims not as people, but as obstacles, people who had what she needed and were too old or too alone to stop her. That mindset, experts noted, was key to understanding how she could carry out the crimes without emotional fallout. She didn't mourn them because she didn't see them. She saw what they could give her. Dana Sue Gray became a case study in female serial homicide, not because of her body count, but because of her motive and method. Female serial killers are statistically rare, and those who kill for material gain are rarer still. But Gray's case shattered the stereotype. She wasn't killing for an accomplice or under the influence of a man. She wasn't following orders. She was in full control. Her trial was brief. With the mounting evidence, including receipts, footage, and a living witness, her legal team advised a guilty plea to avoid capital punishment. The court sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. And just like that, one of the most unlikely serial killers in California history was removed from the streets. But the memory of what she did remains, not just in police files or prison logs, but in the minds of those who now live a little more cautiously, who double-check their locks even in gated communities, who no longer assume a familiar face means safety, and who understand that sometimes evil doesn't arrive in darkness. Sometimes it knocks on your door at noon, asks for a moment of your time, and kills you before you've even realized you were in danger. As the dust of the investigation settled and Dana Sue Gray's name was etched permanently into the annals of American serial crime, law enforcement began to confront an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a one-off anomaly of female rage or some rare explosion of impulse, but rather a new type of killer who operated beneath all the usual flags, using not chaos but routine as her camouflage. In court, she sat calmly through proceedings, rarely showing emotion, often appearing more concerned with the media attention than the testimonies of grieving families. Forensic experts testified about her behavioral profile, calling attention to her extreme narcissism, her shallow affect, and her inability to feel empathy, traits that were hidden behind the persona of a polite, middle-aged woman who smiled easily and presented herself with middle-class, suburban grace. It was this duality that chilled those closest to the case. Prosecutors described how Dana would sometimes commit her murders and then schedule a massage appointment immediately afterward, suggesting not only a lack of guilt, but a total normalization of the violence. Her purchases post-murder were not necessities, but luxuries, indulgences meant to restore a crumbling image of self-worth that had collapsed after her mother's death. The courtroom learned of how she tried to join a gym shortly after one murder, signing up for a premium package using stolen funds. She wanted to look better, feel better, and for a few hours she allowed herself to forget that someone had to die to make that happen. Every victim was stripped not just of life, but of dignity, reduced to nothing more than a means of accessing a shopping spree. Family members of the deceased described the emotional fallout in statements delivered to the court, recalling how safe their mothers, grandmothers, and sisters had once felt, how ordinary the last days of their lives had been. They weren't stalked, they weren't tortured, they weren't warned. Their lives were ended in the span of a few minutes because someone they knew and perhaps even trusted had decided they were worth more dead than alive. After sentencing, Dana was sent to the Central California Women's Facility, a maximum security prison where she would spend the rest of her life. She adapted quickly, reportedly working prison jobs and even mentoring other inmates, a deeply unsettling fact for those who had followed the trial. Reporters noted how her story slowly faded from the front page, overshadowed by more graphic or sensational crimes. But for investigators, Dana's legacy was something they couldn't shake. She represented a blind spot in profiling, a woman who didn't kill out of jealousy or domestic abuse or under the control of a man, but who orchestrated her murders with precision and calm in order to fund her personal comfort. It led to law enforcement agencies revisiting older cold cases involving elderly victims and financial theft, wondering if other killers like her had slipped through unnoticed. Though no additional murders were ever formally linked to Dana, the suspicion remained. Her known spree was short, January to March of 1994, but the ease with which she operated suggested a capacity for far more. She had no known remorse, no signs of guilt, and when asked during a prison evaluation whether she regretted what she'd done, she reportedly said, "I regret getting caught, not the rest." That statement, while never formally published, was circulated among those who worked the case, a haunting reminder of the reality they'd faced, that some killers are not driven by the grotesque, but by the ordinary. They do not stand out. They do not scream. They move quietly, kill quickly, and disappear just as fast. Dana's case became part of FBI training materials on female serial killers. Her psychological assessments were included in criminal justice textbooks, not because she killed the most people, but because of the cold logic she applied to each step of the process. There was no mess, no signature, no theatrics, just a straightforward transaction, life for luxury. And that's what made her terrifying. Because how do you protect against someone who doesn't look like a threat, who acts like a neighbor, a friend, a daughter, who offers a smile and then kills you for your bank card? That's the kind of threat that can't be profiled easily. That's the kind of killer who can live next door and never be noticed until it's too late. As her story faded from headlines, the fear she instilled lingered in every quiet cul-de-sac where elderly women lived alone, every gated community that promised safety but couldn't account for what happens when the killer already knows the gate code. The lesson from Dana Sue Gray's case wasn't just about security, it was about assumptions, about how we assume evil will look a certain way, that it will come loud and violent and disturbed, but sometimes evil comes dressed in beige with a polite knock and a practiced smile, and sometimes it leaves not with a scream, but with a receipt. Her chapter ends not with a chase or a dramatic trial, but with a warning that still echoes through investigative circles. A reminder that in the realm of true crime, the most dangerous person in the room might be the one who doesn't raise their voice at all. With Gray's case closed and her sentence sealed, the story now shifts eastward toward a figure far less known but no less calculated. A man who operated in the overlooked shadows of the American Midwest. A man who didn't need violence to lure his victims, just a Craigslist ad and a promise of work. Albert Fish Jr., no relation to the infamous cannibal of the early 20th century, earned his own terrifying reputation not through grotesque theatrics, but through a methodical use of trust, opportunity, and the growing digital wilderness of online classifieds. His story begins not with blood, but with a job offer, and it ends in the quiet, disturbed soil of rented farmland where the truth lay buried beneath the feet of the unsuspecting. Albert Fish Jr. was not born with the name that would later carry eerie associations, but when investigators first stumbled onto the case that bore his alias, it was impossible to ignore the cruel irony of the moniker. Though unrelated to the infamous early 20th century killer Albert Fish, the man dubbed Junior by the press would earn his place in the annals of true crime for an entirely different kind of brutality. One rooted not in sadism or grotesque ritual, but in calculated manipulation and a grotesque form of pragmatism. His targets were not children or strangers picked at random. They were men, mostly middle-aged, often homeless or down on their luck, who responded to simple job postings offering day labor on small plots of farmland across the Midwest. The ads promised cash, a few days' work, a warm meal, and shelter in exchange for help maintaining a property or moving equipment. There were no red flags, no background checks, and no reason to doubt the opportunity. For most, the offer was a blessing. For some, it was a death sentence. The pattern began surfacing quietly around 2009 in a spread of counties across Indiana and southern Illinois. Local deputies began noticing a disturbing frequency of abandoned vehicles left on rural service roads, often still containing personal belongings. There was no sign of forced entry, no reports of theft, and no immediate connections between the owners. What there was, however, was a subtle digital trail. Emails sent to Craigslist addresses with subject lines like "job needed" or "hard worker available." Slowly, a handful of missing persons reports began to reference similar phrases, similar meeting spots, and always the promise of short-term work in isolated places. Most of these men had no next of kin who could sound the alarm quickly. Some were estranged from family. Others were habitual drifters whose sudden disappearance didn't trigger concern until weeks had passed. But as more reports accumulated, a broader pattern began to emerge. People were disappearing after responding to similar ads, and none of them were coming back. It wasn't until 2012 that investigators finally found a body. A farmhand working the outer edge of an abandoned property near Vincennes, Indiana, uncovered a disturbed patch of earth while tilling soil. Beneath the surface, he discovered human remains, partially decomposed, bound at the wrists, with a plastic zip tie still wrapped tightly around the neck. The state of decomposition made identification difficult, but forensic investigators managed to match dental records to a missing person who had last emailed a Craigslist job listing posted under the alias AF Junior Jobs. The handle stood out. Investigators, already searching through IP addresses and web logs, quickly linked several other job listings to the same digital fingerprint. Whoever AFJR Jobs was, he was hunting for victims through classifieds, using work as bait, and he was careful to scrub much of his trail. The email accounts were routed through public libraries and burner cell phones. The meeting locations changed frequently. Barns, disused grain silos, storage sheds on remote land owned by shell corporations. But the pattern was unmistakable. The suspect lured his victims into unfamiliar rural areas, asked them to bring minimal belongings, and promised cash upon completion of labor. Once there, it appeared he subdued them, likely through blunt trauma or strangulation, and buried them nearby in shallow graves. What made the crimes particularly chilling wasn't the method of murder alone, but the simplicity and sustainability of the system. Fish Jr. didn't need complex plans. He relied on the vulnerability of desperate men, on the silence that comes when the voiceless go missing, and on the anonymity of digital classifieds that allowed him to disappear as easily as he appeared. When police finally connected the burner accounts to surveillance footage at a small-town gas station, they identified a man in his late 30s with no prior arrests, driving a rusted-out pickup truck and wearing plain workwear. He purchased gloves, bleach, and duct tape, all paid for in cash. From that moment, the investigation accelerated. Surveillance teams followed financial trails, watched ATM withdrawals, and tracked mileage logs from fuel purchases. Eventually, they located a small hunting cabin registered under a Shell LLC, connected to a P.O. box tied to one of the job ad email addresses. Inside that cabin, they found the evidence they needed to confirm their worst fears: zip ties, shovels, work gloves, a ledger with dates, names, and brief descriptions. First names only, some with the word "done" written next to them. In a locked cabinet, they discovered wallets, IDs, and personal effects of at least 7 missing men. There were also maps with markings around properties that were later searched and confirmed as burial sites. With a search warrant in hand, investigators moved on the cabin while the suspect, later confirmed to be 41-year-old Robert Alden posing as Albert Fish Jr., was returning from another supply run. He was arrested without incident, and during interrogation he refused to speak for nearly 72 hours. When he finally did, his reasoning was bone-chilling in its indifference. He claimed he wasn't killing for pleasure. He was eliminating waste. In his mind, these were men who no one cared about, who couldn't pay rent, who had nothing to offer. He called them floaters and ghosts, people who, in his words, could vanish and no one would care. That phrase alone was enough to galvanize prosecutors, who pursued the case with relentless fury. What made the story particularly haunting for the public was not just the cruelty of the crimes, but the existential fear it invoked. The idea that someone could disappear simply by answering a job ad, and that their absence would be noticed by no one. For every confirmed victim, there were potentially others, cases never filed, names never reported, and for each of them, there was only dirt, isolation, and a silent death in a forgotten field. In court, the prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the killings, the repetition of tactics, the precision of the burial sites, and the fact that Fish Jr. had chosen his alias not randomly, but deliberately invoking the horror of a name once synonymous with evil. Though his methods were different, his disregard for human life was just as terrifying. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict him on 7 counts of first-degree murder and multiple charges of unlawful disposal of human remains. He was sentenced to life without parole, but as authorities later admitted, even that conviction felt incomplete, because some ghosts, once created, never find their names again. After the trial and conviction of Robert Alden, publicly branded as Albert Fish Jr., the case didn't conclude with the clang of a gavel. It widened. What authorities thought was the end of a spree turned out to be just the beginning of a deeper, darker dive into the backlogs of rural disappearances that had quietly stacked up over the past decade in regions no one had ever considered connected. From Kansas to Ohio, detectives began sharing files, comparing missing persons whose profiles echoed the same traits. Single men, often unemployed or transient, last seen responding to job ads or accepting under-the-table labor offers in remote areas. The circumstances were too specific to ignore. These men weren't vanishing in urban chaos or amidst criminal disputes. They were disappearing in silence without a ripple. Fish Jr.'s arrest had unlocked more than a conviction. It had torn open the uncomfortable truth that one man, operating under a veil of ordinary labor, had potentially built a killing circuit across multiple states without drawing national attention. At the center of this re-examination was a binder discovered in the floorboards of the cabin, missed during the initial sweep. Found during a follow-up inspection prompted by a tip from another inmate who claimed Fish Jr. had boasted about keeping records under the boards. The binder was filled with pages of handwritten notes, maps, job listings printed from classified sites, and most damning of all, photographs. These weren't trophies in the traditional sense. No bloody clothing, no preserved remains, but images of the job sites taken before the killings, neatly labeled, time-stamped, and annotated with details about the surrounding landscape, terrain, and potential burial depths. Each photo was tied to a property, each property tied to a missing person, and each entry ended with a single word scrawled in thick pen across the bottom of the page: closed. The implication was devastating. Fish Jr. had not only premeditated each murder with surgical precision, but he had also documented them like a project manager closing out completed tasks. Cold, bureaucratic, unfeeling. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to assess the psychological makeup behind such obsessive record-keeping. Their report, later unsealed through a Freedom of Information Act request, detailed a profile of a high-functioning sociopath whose need for control manifested not just in the act of murder, but in the organization of it. He treated each killing as a logistical exercise, an operation to be planned, executed, and recorded. He didn't kill impulsively. He killed like someone following a manual, a checklist of invisible rules he believed no one else could see. It became evident that the murders weren't just crimes, they were systems. In analyzing the property acquisitions to Fish Jr., investigators discovered a series of LLCs created under false names and tax IDs. These shell companies were used to rent or lease small plots of farmland, storage units, and rural buildings where victims were invited under the pretense of contract labor. Fish Jr. often paid cash for rentals, sometimes under the table, exploiting rural property owners who didn't ask too many questions and rarely demanded documentation. In one case, he had signed a 6-month lease for a barn on a cornfield outside Evansville, Indiana, and used it exclusively to stage his fake job operations. The leaseholder later admitted he never once visited the property during the term of the lease, trusting that the money arrived on time and the land was being used as promised. That barn later yielded 2 sets of human remains. Both victims had been reported missing within weeks of each other, and both had last contacted the same job posting. One later traced back to Fish Jr.'s aliases. Investigators were increasingly disturbed by the level of forethought that had gone into these setups. He often used VoIP numbers routed through international servers, and his email correspondence was clean, professional, and typo-free, lending an air of credibility that lowered suspicion. Victims felt reassured, not threatened. Several even forwarded emails to friends expressing excitement about finally getting some paid work. That trust cost them their lives. One of the more haunting discoveries came when a surviving potential victim came forward after seeing news coverage of the trial. He told police he had met Fish Jr. at a gas station just outside of Terre Haute, Indiana. The man, who had responded to a job ad for help moving equipment, claimed Fish Jr. was polite, soft-spoken, and well-prepared. He provided a printed contract, a map to the worksite, and even offered to buy the man lunch before beginning the job. But when the potential victim arrived at the location and saw the isolation of the site, no neighbors for miles, no cell signal, and only one entrance road, he became uneasy. He told Fish Jr. he had changed his mind. The suspect didn't argue. He simply nodded, shook the man's hand, and said, "Maybe next time." That escape was pure instinct. Had the man ignored his gut and gone inside, he likely would have joined the others in an unmarked grave. His testimony added a rare layer of insight into the killer's demeanor. There was no coercion, no force, just persuasion and the weaponization of calm confidence. Fish Jr. had mastered the art of being forgettable. In every interaction, he made sure he wasn't the focus. He asked questions, let others speak, and maintained an expressionless tone that neither alarmed nor aroused curiosity. That lack of memorable traits made him nearly invisible to casual witnesses and deeply dangerous in his ability to avoid suspicion. As prosecutors pushed for the closure of related cold cases, forensic teams continued searching the properties outlined in the recovered binder. Some had been developed since the time of the murders, complicating excavation efforts. Others were inaccessible due to legal disputes over ownership or local resistance to digging up the past, especially in communities that feared the attention such discoveries might bring. But the searches persisted. Cadaver dogs were deployed, ground-penetrating radar was used, and more remains were found. Sometimes complete skeletons, sometimes only partial. Each one confirmed the horrifying scale of Fish Jr.'s operation. Though officially convicted of 7 murders, law enforcement now believes he may be responsible for as many as 15, possibly more. His trial, though already concluded, left open the possibility of future charges should more victims be identified. But the most sobering realization for the public was how easily it had all unfolded. There had been no screams, no shootouts, no dramatic escapes, just a man with a pickup truck, a shovel, and a smile, offering jobs, closing graves, and vanishing into the same rural stillness that had hidden him for years. The final chapter of the Albert Fish Jr. case wasn't written in a courtroom, but in the margins of old missing persons reports that had long since collected dust in police archives. As forensic teams revisited rural parcels of land following the maps he so obsessively documented, they discovered what had likely remained hidden for over a decade: unmarked burial sites, sometimes layered with construction fill or natural overgrowth, containing skeletal remains that bore the signature elements of Fish Jr.'s methodology: shallow graves, wrists bound with zip ties, wallets stripped of identification, and in some cases, clothing consistent with what the victims were last seen wearing. The discoveries weren't cinematic. They were quiet, clinical, and devastating. In interviews conducted with surviving families, a pattern of emotional paralysis emerged. Many had spent years wondering if their loved ones had simply walked away from their lives, victims of addiction, mental health issues, or bad luck. Some had even assumed their relatives were alive but unreachable, living transient lives too unstable for regular contact. To learn that those loved ones had not only been murdered but methodically hunted, lured, and buried in silence was a kind of closure that came wrapped in grief so heavy it suffocated. Authorities were left with the task of attempting to reconstruct not just a timeline of deaths, but a geography of them, mapping the expanses of isolation that Fish Jr. had exploited, calculating the time he would have needed to dig, kill, clean, and drive to his next posting. One particular detail sent chills through investigators. In a post-arrest interview, Fish Jr. reportedly smirked when asked how he selected his burial sites. "I never used the same place twice," he said. "People remember holes, That line became an unofficial epitaph for his style of killing, a brutal pragmatism cloaked in mundane execution. He was a man without theatrics, without delusions of grandeur or ritualistic fantasies. He didn't keep trophies in the traditional sense. He didn't mark his victims with symbols. He simply made them vanish, managed the logistics, and moved on. What this case illustrated more clearly than any before was that modern serial killing had evolved. It was no longer the domain of the deranged loner scrawling symbols in blood or calling the police to brag. Instead, it had become procedural, digitized, and disturbingly scalable. Fish Jr. showed how, in an era of Craigslist and cash-based labor, a predator could engineer the perfect hunting ground, one where every transaction left just enough ambiguity for blame to be scattered, for timelines to be delayed, and for disappearances to look like personal decisions instead of crimes. His use of language in job listings was particularly scrutinized. Investigators noted how each ad avoided red flags. They were clear, professional, and non-threatening. He offered temporary work opportunities for general field maintenance, included instructions for DS directions, and even answered follow-up emails with calm, friendly tone. He mimicked the language of trust, and in doing so, he built a trap that required no physical restraints, just the promise of dignity and cash to someone desperate enough to ignore the warning signs. His conviction didn't lead to grand justice, only the quiet removal of a name from the list of active predators. The true damage he inflicted may never be fully known. Local jurisdictions continued to reopen dormant missing persons files, and forensic teams rotated through excavation zones in a slow, exhaustive process. Meanwhile, Fish Jr. remained in a maximum security federal facility, reportedly uncooperative and unbothered. He received no visitors, granted no interviews, and spent his time cataloging books in the prison library. His form of ritual now confined to shelving instead of shallow graves. But what haunted the agents who brought him down was the ease with which he operated. There were no weapons caches, no underground lairs, no coded diaries. There was only a laptop, a phone, and a truck, tools that anyone could use. It served as a brutal reminder that monsters no longer needed to hide in forests or basements. They could be anywhere, advertising on platforms we scroll past every day. The aftershocks of the case sparked nationwide changes in how online job platforms managed anonymous postings. Craigslist, already under scrutiny for criminal misuse, began implementing stricter policies, requiring email verification and location tracking for labor-based ads. Law enforcement began building more sophisticated data models to track digital patterns that fit Fish Jr.'s mold, patterns of opportunity predators who cast wide nets and counted on the vulnerability of the unseen. True crime forums dissected every detail of the investigation, theorizing about the unknown victims, speculating on the pages of the binder that remained partially redacted, and turning Fish Jr. into both a case study and a warning. But within law enforcement, the case wasn't about notoriety. It was about failure, the failure to recognize the early signs, to connect cases across county lines, and to understand that sometimes evil doesn't shout. Sometimes it whispers with a keyboard and buries its sins in farmland. And when that evil finally recedes into prison walls, it leaves behind not just graves, but questions that may never be fully answered. How many more were there? Who else might have crossed paths with him and simply never resurfaced? And how many more killers like him walk among us, not wearing masks, but shaking hands, offering work and waiting for someone to say yes? With the files now sealed and the case closed on its primary charges, authorities moved on, but the map remained open, an ever-expanding reminder that justice rarely keeps pace with horror. And just as the story of Fish Jr. began with an ad, so too does the next name on this list of American ruthlessness. Charles Severance didn't need farmland or fake companies. He didn't operate in the wilderness. He walked the streets of Virginia, rang doorbells, and opened fire. His motive wasn't cash, it was ideology, resentment, and a twisted manifesto against the pillars of society he believed had betrayed him. As the case files shift from the farmland graves of the Midwest to the polished neighborhoods of Alexandria, another kind of killer emerges. Not one who hunts the invisible, but one who targets the visible, the established, and the comfortable, all in the name of revenge disguised as revolution. Charles Severance did not lurk in shadows or hide in basements. He walked with purpose through manicured neighborhoods, past picket fences and trimmed lawns, into the very spaces that symbolized order, civility, and American routine. Where Albert Fish Jr. operated in isolated farmland and used digital tools to ensnare the invisible, Severance took a different path. One that led him to the front doors of people who thought they were safe in the comfort of suburban predictability. Between 2003 and 2014, Alexandria, Virginia, a city known for its cobblestone streets, colonial charm, and proximity to Washington, D.C., became the unexpected hunting ground of a killer whose weapon was not stealth, but ideology. Severance believed that American society was sick, corrupted by elitism, and poisoned by what he called tyrannical domesticity. He referred to his victims not as individuals, but as symbols, representations of a system he despised. His targets were not chosen randomly, but with calculated intention. They were prominent figures, often with connections to local government, business, or the judicial system. The killings were spaced years apart, but each carried the same eerie signature. The victim was shot at close range on their doorstep, often in broad daylight, with no warning and no immediate motive. It began with the 2003 murder of Nancy Dunning, a respected real estate agent and wife of the Alexandria sheriff. She was found inside her home, shot multiple times. The case stunned the community and perplexed law enforcement. There was no sign of forced entry, no robbery, no obvious suspect. Investigators assumed it was a one-off, tragic, perhaps targeted, but not part of a broader pattern. But they were wrong. 11 years later, in 2013, transportation planner Ronald Kirby was gunned down in his own home. Again, the scene showed no sign of struggle. Again, no valuables were taken. Then in early 2014, Ruth Ann Lodato, a music teacher from a prominent family, was shot at her front door after answering a knock. A witness in the home gave a description of the shooter, a man with graying hair and a slight frame who fled on foot. The resemblance to the earlier cases forced authorities to re-examine old evidence. What they began to see was chilling. A serial pattern hidden in plain sight, stretched across a decade, cloaked in the randomness of domestic life. The FBI joined local law enforcement to form a task force. They reanalyzed ballistics, interviewed surviving family members, and looked for commonalities between the victims. What they discovered was a shared civic footprint. Each victim had participated in some form of public service or held a community role that Severance, in his warped worldview, viewed as part of the oppressive structure of modern America. He kept a journal, later recovered from his vehicle, in which he wrote rants about the bureaucratic elite, civilian overlords, and domestic engineers of tyranny. These were not the ravings of a mind lost to chaos, but carefully crafted manifestos that hinted at deep ideological rage. Severance, it turned out, had a long history of mental instability. He had previously run for mayor of Alexandria and later for Congress, both times espousing bizarre political beliefs and calling for a return to tribal justice. He believed in dismantling institutions, reimagining American life through a lens of chaos and decentralization. His campaigns were dismissed as eccentric sideshows, and his rhetoric was written off as harmless extremism. No one connected his fringe politics to the bloodshed playing out in driveways and entry halls. But once authorities began stitching together the timeline, the puzzle sharpened. Surveillance footage near the Lodato murder placed a vehicle matching Severance's car in the vicinity. A search of his belongings uncovered .22 caliber ammunition consistent with that used in the killings. More damningly, investigators found drafts of his journal referencing a doctrine called the sovereign door, which he described as the point of access where the facade of civilized life could be broken. He believed that attacking someone at their doorstep disrupted not just their physical space, but their psychological sanctum, the illusion of safety within the home. To him, the front door was a weak point in the armor of the elite, and by targeting it, he was striking at the core of their power. In interviews, prosecutors would later describe his philosophy as an architecture of paranoia, a belief system that fused anti-establishment rhetoric with personal vendetta. Severance did not view his victims as people, but as agents of the system. By removing them, he believed he was enacting a form of cosmic justice. That belief was what made him so dangerous. Not only was he a skilled marksman and careful in execution, but he was also convinced that his violence had purpose, that he was a prophet operating on a higher moral plane. When he was finally arrested in March 2014, he was carrying writings that referenced cleansing flames and the death of domesticity. His defense team would later argue that he was mentally unfit to stand trial, citing long-standing diagnoses and erratic behavior. But the court disagreed. The killings were not impulsive. They were spaced, deliberate, and planned. Severance understood what he was doing and went to great lengths to avoid detection. He had no digital footprint. He paid in cash. He scouted neighborhoods on foot. He studied his victims. This was not the work of a man in a fugue state. It was the methodical unraveling of someone who knew exactly what line he was crossing and crossed it with focus. In court, Severance remained quiet, only occasionally scribbling notes or glaring at reporters. His lack of remorse was matched only by his lack of acknowledgement. He refused to refer to the victims by name and continued to speak in abstract terms. "Symbols must fall," he wrote in a note passed to his lawyer, "or the lie will endure." That note became a focal point for the prosecution, used to prove both intent and ideology. The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The aftermath of his conviction left the city of Alexandria reeling. How could a man walk through its streets for years, living quietly, and execute prominent citizens with such precision and not be detected? How could ideology rooted in madness manifest in such a targeted campaign? These questions remain unanswered. But what remains is the reality that Charles Severance redefined what a serial killer could look like in the modern age. Not a shadowed figure slipping into alleyways, but a man with a manifesto and a grudge, standing on your porch, ringing the bell. Once the dust settled after Charles Severance's conviction, investigators and analysts began dissecting the broader implications of his crimes. Not just to understand the mind behind the murders, but to expose the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed someone like him to operate undetected for over a decade. The murders had occurred in an affluent city with a well-funded police force within walking distance of the nation's capital. Yet there had been no early warning, no behavioral pattern identified in time, and no tangible link between the crimes until far too late. The unsettling truth was that Severance had chosen his victims with terrifying precision, targeting them not just for who they were, but for what they represented. He moved like a ghost through the fabric of suburban American life, exploiting the very social structures he loathed. Each crime scene was a reflection of his ideological rage, carefully crafted to communicate a message that only he fully understood. But to the outside world, the message was chaos. He didn't spray bullets wildly or leave behind manifestos like more modern spree killers. He didn't stage scenes or seek post-mortem notoriety. Instead, he engaged in surgical executions, cold, calculated, and disturbingly intimate. A knock at the door, a face at the threshold, a single shot. Then nothing. Silence. A body crumpled in a foyer. A city left rattled. Authorities began examining not only his history, but his patterns of movement, using old surveillance footage and toll booth records to trace his routes over the years. What they discovered was a disturbing consistency. Severance traveled in loops, revisiting neighborhoods months before an attack, sometimes walking through them in the early morning hours with a backpack and a notebook. He took notes on house layouts, the timing of mail deliveries, traffic patterns, and even the type of locks used on certain doors. He had no digital trail, no emails, no phone logs, no GPS. He paid cash for gas, used public transportation when necessary, and never spoke to neighbors. He didn't stand out. That invisibility was his weapon. What terrified law enforcement was the degree to which he fit into the background. He wasn't the unstable drifter or the screaming protester. He was a man who wore clean clothes, walked with a limp caused by a childhood injury, and greeted strangers with a nod. That ordinariness became the perfect camouflage. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit would later describe him as a functioning ideologue, someone whose extremism didn't result in public outbursts or violent rhetoric, but in methodical planning and internal justification. His writings revealed an obsession with purity and decay, using language typically found in revolutionary tracts. He referred to suburban homes as temples of deceit and neighborhood watch programs as civilian militias protecting tyranny. His disdain for domestic structure was visceral. He saw every mailbox, every lawn gnome, every garage door opener as part of a collective hallucination, an illusion of safety protecting a lie. In his mind, by executing people at their doorsteps, he was tearing holes in the facade. When questioned post-conviction in a series of psychological evaluations, Severance remained evasive but consistent. He never admitted guilt, but he never denied involvement either. Instead, he spoke in riddles. He referred to his victims as installations and his crimes as removals. When asked if he felt remorse, he replied, "Do you grieve when you break false idols?" His answers were not those of a man seeking to be understood, but of someone who believed he was already understood by a higher purpose. The idea of repentance was irrelevant to him. He believed he had already delivered judgment. One of the most disturbing aspects of his preparation came to light when investigators uncovered an abandoned storage unit registered under an alias. Inside were dozens of spiral notebooks filled with handwriting. Pages and pages of ideological rantings, target sketches, lists of home addresses, and time logs detailing when certain houses were likely to be empty or vulnerable. Some entries were crossed out, others were circled with annotations like "no pattern" or "too many windows." It was clear that he had considered dozens of potential targets, many of whom may have had no idea they were ever at risk. The randomness of who died versus who didn't became even more terrifying. It wasn't just about symbolic targeting, it was also about opportunity. If a homeowner wasn't present or if neighbors were too alert, he would abandon the attempt and move on. He had no emotional attachment to the victims themselves, only to the act. The doorbell was his trigger. It signified everything he despised, the boundary between private deceit and public delusion. Breaking that barrier by force with a bullet was his revolution. Law enforcement scrambled to notify individuals whose names or addresses appeared in the recovered notebook, sparking a second wave of community panic. People who had once considered themselves merely part of the concerned public suddenly realized they might have been future victims. Some moved. Others installed surveillance systems or hired private security. Severance's reach extended beyond those he killed. It infected an entire city's sense of security. His crimes had not only taken lives, but broken the illusion of control that so many people held dear. The prosecution team, still shaken by the nature of the evidence, disclosed that some of the notebooks referenced cycles, suggesting that Severance operated on a philosophical calendar, possibly tied to anniversaries or personal beliefs. While the exact meaning of these cycles was never fully uncovered, they offered chilling insight into his state of mind. He wasn't driven by impulse, nor by hatred of individuals. He was driven by doctrine, and, like all doctrine, his was structured, repeatable, and justified in his own eyes. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a teacher, and the lesson, brutal as it was, came in the form of a muzzle flash at the front door. The ripple effects of his ideology continued even after his imprisonment. Online forums, many on the darker corners of the internet, began circulating his writings, treating them as manifestos rather than warning signs. Though most mainstream platforms scrubbed the content, copies remained. Law enforcement grew increasingly concerned about the potential for ideological copycats, individuals who might adopt Severance's view of domestic life as a corrupt structure in need of violent dismantling. While none of his writings directly called for others to follow in his footsteps, their tone was seductive to the disenfranchised. Phrases like, "The home is the lie they sold you," and "Only fire opens locked minds," became eerie rallying cries among fringe digital communities. That influence, however small, elevated Severance from isolated threat to ideological symbol. And while his body was behind bars, his ideas weren't. In a society increasingly fractured along political and economic lines, the fear wasn't just that another Severance might appear. It was that someone already had, and was just waiting for the right door to knock on. The true horror of Charles Severance's story wasn't simply that he killed, but that he waited. In a world saturated by chaos, where crimes are often committed in haste and killers act on impulse, Severance stood as a cold anomaly, patient, calculating, and disturbingly measured. He wasn't a man who snapped. He was a man who simmered. He let time soften the attention drawn to each murder, knowing full well how fast the world moved, how headlines faded, how people returned to routine once the flowers wilted and the memorials were cleared away. The spaces he violated, the doorsteps, the foyers, the family homes, remained scarred long after the bullets stopped flying. He had weaponized the illusion of safety and in doing so redefined terror in a domestic landscape. But what unnerved law enforcement the most wasn't just what he did, it was what he didn't do. There were no frantic movements, no desperate cover-ups, no trail of panic that typically followed serial offenders. Severance was composed even in the aftermath. He vanished after each act like a ghost swallowed by suburban fog, returning to his life with the same calm he carried to the doorstep. That calm was what gave him away in the end. A quiet too practiced, a hatred too focused. While behind bars, psychological experts attempted to mine Severance's thoughts for insights. Most failed. He spoke in metaphors. He answered questions with questions. And when he did speak plainly, it was only to correct a mischaracterization. "I didn't hate them," he once said during an interview. "I hated what they symbolized." That was the core of his pathology. Abstraction. To Severance, people weren't people. They were symbols to be destroyed. The victims weren't random, but the method was consistent. Doorbells, daytime, distance closed in an instant. No conversation, no demand, just a round from a .22 revolver and a fleeing silhouette. Each crime had a cold symmetry that bordered on ritual, though not in any spiritual sense. It was mechanical, repeated, refined. Investigators later compiled the full behavioral pattern into a profile that was distributed across FBI training modules. Severance was no longer just a criminal. He was now a case study in ideological violence, masquerading as targeted homicide. But what couldn't be trained, couldn't be studied, was the fear he left behind. Alexandria, Virginia, a place known more for its history tours and federal contractors than serial homicide, felt altered. Real estate agents reported clients asking about door camera installations before price. Homeowners started replacing glass panels with steel reinforcements. Even local schools altered their security drills. incorporating doorstep protocols into lockdown plans. The city had absorbed a trauma that rewrote its daily routines, and that trauma extended beyond the region. Criminologists began linking his patterns to a broader category of offenders, those driven by distorted manifestos rather than psychological compulsions. They called it symbolic targeting, a hybrid pathology blending personal vendetta with abstract ideological warfare. Severance, it seemed, wasn't an outlier. He was a precursor. In online spaces where disillusionment festers unchecked, more voices echoed his writings. The line between a manifesto and a motive blurred, and while his physical presence was contained, his ideological ripples weren't. Law enforcement quietly launched digital task forces to track mentions of his language, especially those referencing his coined phrase, "the sovereign door." What began as a term buried in a notebook was now circulating in encrypted forums. The FBI feared that others, especially those radicalized online, might mimic his methods, not out of loyalty, but out of resonance. Severance had cracked something primal, the vulnerability of the home. The idea that your front door could be the final threshold between life and death. That terror didn't need to come from the dark alley or the isolated woods. It could walk up the steps, knock politely, and deliver judgment in the form of a muzzle flash. Prosecutors who worked the case noted that the emotional toll lingered long after the conviction. One assistant DA reportedly changed residences after the trial, citing nightly paranoia and the inability to answer the door without checking every window first. Another juror confessed in an interview that she installed motion sensors and carried a taser, not out of immediate fear, but because he showed us how thin the walls really are. The societal impact of Severance's crimes went beyond legal reform. It became a psychological watermark, proof that even in places steeped in order and privilege, the system can be perforated by a man with a plan, a pistol, and a personal gospel of destruction. And though justice was served, the discomfort remained, because Severance didn't scream. He didn't run. He walked, knocked, aimed, left. That style, the calmness, the calculation, became a haunting thread that carried over to the next name on the list, the final name. Where Severance used ideology, this next killer used obsession. Where Severance stalked symbols, this man stalked patterns, letters, initials, grids of victims he cataloged like a twisted alphabet. Joseph Nasso wasn't driven by politics or a hatred for institutions. He was driven by something far more chilling: control. His killings, spanning decades, were tied together by a cryptic list, a handwritten death diary discovered in a locked safe after his arrest. It contained the names of women whose first and last initials matched: Roxine Rogish, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya. The press called him the Alphabet Killer, a moniker that masked the methodical madness underneath. With the transition from ideology to pattern, the script of horror flipped again. Because where Severance shattered the illusion of safety at the threshold of the home, Nasso obliterated it by turning his victims into puzzles, pieces in a game that only he knew the rules to. He didn't need the front door. He needed the thrill of structure, of naming, of ending lives in a sequence that he believed made him invisible. As the investigation into Nasso's diary unfolded, law enforcement realized that this wasn't just a list, it was a scorecard. And the score, by the time he was caught, was far higher than anyone had expected. Joseph Nasso had the appearance of someone easily forgotten. He was quiet, elderly, and lived in a modest home in Reno, Nevada, where neighbors described him as odd, but not dangerous. He often walked alone, carried a camera, and claimed to be a freelance photographer. He went to the supermarket weekly, rarely spoke more than a sentence to anyone, and paid in cash. But behind the wrinkled face and unassuming posture was a man who had, over decades, turned murder into a meticulous pattern. one that law enforcement would only begin to unravel after a probation officer inspecting his home found what would become one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in modern serial killer history. Inside a locked safe was a yellowed notebook, its pages filled with handwritten names. The list was titled Girl Number 1, Girl Number 2, continuing all the way through Girl Number 10. But what caught investigators' attention was not just the list itself. It was the peculiar alphabetical consistency. Each name on the list had the same first and last initial: Roxine Rogash, Carmen Colon, Pamela Parsons, Tracy Tafoya. All dead, all killed in eerily similar fashion, all matching initials. At first glance, it seemed like coincidence, but as detectives cross-referenced the names with cold cases stretching back to the late 1970s, the pattern solidified into something deliberate. What followed was a full-scale re-examination of unsolved homicides across California and Nevada. As evidence mounted, it became clear that Joseph Naso had orchestrated a methodical killing spree that spanned decades. He wasn't prolific in the way other serial killers had been. He didn't rack up dozens of confirmed victims in a year, but he was consistent, calculated. He killed women in intervals, stored their photographs, logged their names, and disappeared back into anonymity like a man clocking in and out of a job. Investigators found hundreds of photos in his possession, many of women in staged poses, some unconscious or deceased, their identities never confirmed. He kept notes alongside the images, describing outfits, locations, and in some cases, the approximate date of their deaths. The photo documentation became key in reconstructing his movements. He had traveled up and down the West Coast, frequently returning to areas near Oakland, Sacramento, and rural parts of Northern California. His victims were often vulnerable: sex workers, transient individuals, women with addiction issues. But this was not merely opportunism, it was structure. Naso had a fixation with pairing his victims to a system of letters, assigning them to categories, creating order out of violence. He wasn't sloppy. His crime scenes lacked clear DNA. Bodies were often dumped in remote locations, and physical evidence was minimal. In many cases, the causes of death weren't obvious: strangulation that left faint markings, overdoses that may have been staged, asphyxiation that could be missed by initial autopsies. He had a clinical touch, and his ability to remain invisible relied not on luck, but on the cold design of his crimes. Law enforcement discovered that Naso had kept the notebook for over 30 years. He had moved it from home to home, even across state lines. It wasn't for show, it was for remembrance. He didn't boast, he archived. In interviews, he denied everything, insisting the list was just ideas for photography projects. But the dates, the names, and the proximity to real, murdered women told a different story. One entry read, Girl Number 6, Lodi, 1988, nice smile, which coincided with the murder of a young woman named Sarah Dillon, found strangled outside of Lodi in that exact year. Her initials matched. Her case had gone cold, written off as a drug-related incident. It wasn't until her name appeared in the notebook that investigators realized she may have been part of a much darker legacy. But Naso didn't stop at names. In one box in his garage, authorities found hundreds of negatives, many undeveloped. Inside, more images of unidentified women, some smiling, some unaware they were being photographed. Others posed as if asleep. Each photograph was time-stamped and labeled with a number corresponding to an entry in his journals. Prosecutors later revealed that the system was so well organized they could trace his movement across counties with precision. He kept receipts for gas stations. He documented weather conditions. He noted the color of the sky on the day of each photo session. That attention to detail extended to his crimes. Bodies were often found wrapped in layers of plastic, clothes removed but folded nearby, faces wiped clean. No fingerprints, no hair, just silence. What made Naso especially terrifying was that he wasn't driven by impulse or rage. There were no reports of violent outbursts, no warning signs in his behavior. He had a long criminal record, but it was filled with petty thefts, minor violations, nothing that screamed serial killer. He blended in by being unmemorable, and that invisibility gave him power. It allowed him to return to normalcy after each murder. He shopped at the same stores, he ate at diners, he even attended photography meetups in the community, showing off images of sunsets and street life as if the other photos didn't exist. But they did, tucked away in his safe, labeled, numbered, and hidden. When authorities finally pieced together enough to arrest him in 2010, they did so knowing they only had partial proof. They could tie him directly to 4 confirmed murders. The rest, 6 more names on the list, remained in limbo. Not enough evidence, no DNA, just a pattern, a haunting, deliberate pattern. At trial, prosecutors leaned heavily on the notebook, calling it his death diary. They showed jurors the handwriting, the matching initials, the photos. They outlined the structure, pointed to the travel logs, and mapped out the timeline of deaths. Naso sat silently, rarely reacting. When he did speak, it was only to proclaim his innocence and suggest that the real killer was probably someone with access to the same notes. He never explained how that would be possible. The jury took less than a day to convict him on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin State Prison. But even after conviction, Naso remained an enigma. He gave no confessions, offered no insight, and continued to deny everything. Yet in the mind of every investigator, the question lingered. How many more names were out there? How many more women matched his twisted criteria but never made it onto the list? And how many bodies were still out there, buried, discarded, or never reported missing at all? The silence left in his wake was deafening, because unlike other serial killers who craved attention or reveled in notoriety, Joseph Naso seemed content to vanish into obscurity. He didn't need recognition. He had his notebook. His legacy was private, stored between pages, labeled with precision and hidden behind a locked door. And that made him, perhaps, the most terrifying kind of killer, the one who doesn't want to be remembered, only obeyed by his own system. With 2 more paragraphs left in his case, the horror deepens. Because the more investigators unpack the photos and documents, the more they realize this wasn't about names or letters. It was about control and a man who played God, one name at a time. As law enforcement continued dissecting the contents of Joseph Naso's house, what they uncovered wasn't just evidence. It was a psychological autopsy of a serial killer who had created his own silent universe. One where rules were rigid, victims were nameless, and control was everything. Among the most disturbing discoveries were the detailed photo catalogs, each image carefully labeled with the same detached efficiency one might use when filing tax receipts. Dozens of women were documented in various stages of vulnerability, some clearly unconscious, others staged in ways that suggested they were no longer alive, and many whose identities remained unknown. Naso had not just taken these photographs to preserve memories. He had created an archive of power. Each entry was more than a trophy. It was a preserved moment where he was in absolute command, a frozen frame of domination, and the patterns continued to reveal themselves. In multiple journals found near the safe, Naso had listed strange numeric sequences next to each name, dates and references to locations that at first seemed irrelevant. But when overlaid with state highway records, motel receipts, and regional maps, a deeper structure emerged. Investigators realized that Naso operated within a narrow corridor of activity, primarily Northern California and parts of Nevada. He frequented specific motels that offered rates and minimal ID checks, often using aliases tied to historical figures or Latin words, a habit that matched his penchant for categorization. Every trip was methodical. Every kill was scheduled. Naso didn't stalk in the traditional sense. He selected, isolated, recorded, and removed. His victims were plucked from transient environments, bus stops, clinics, shelters. He chose women with minimal social tethering, not because he saw them as lesser, but because their absence wouldn't trigger urgent inquiries. Their stories wouldn't make front-page news. Their disappearances could be chalked up to lifestyle or circumstance. It wasn't just, it was strategy. And within that strategy was the even darker realization that many of his victims may never be identified at all. DNA testing helped confirm identities for 4 of the victims, but the remaining entries in his journals were so cryptic and the photographs so anonymized that piecing together timelines became almost impossible. Forensics teams were forced to rely on analog cues, carpet textures, wallpaper patterns, the make of certain vehicles, and sunlight angles to determine rough dates. The more they analyzed, the more they saw just how far Naso had gone to control not just the act of murder, but the entire framework surrounding it. He had mapped out areas he deemed disposal zones, secluded parts of national forests and riverbeds marked in his notebooks with crude hand-drawn grids. In some of these zones, authorities discovered disturbed earth, shallow depressions that, when examined by ground-penetrating radar, revealed human remains that had long since decomposed beyond recognition. No identifying features, no dental records matched, no missing persons cases aligned, just bones buried under silence. And then came the financial records. Despite his relatively frugal lifestyle, Naso had managed to maintain several bank accounts across different states. He moved small amounts between them in irregular intervals, not enough to raise red flags, but clearly part of a larger plan. One theory suggested he was paying off people who helped procure victims, though no co-conspirators were ever found. Another theory pointed to his background as a military photographer in the 1950s, speculating that his training had informed his systematic process and perhaps even taught him techniques for surveillance, record-keeping, and misdirection. But even with those leads, nothing concrete materialized. Naso remained a closed loop, an isolated architect of cruelty who needed no validation, no audience, and no help. His trial, however, gave the public its first full glimpse into the depth of his pathology. In the courtroom, he was quiet, never emotional. He represented himself, dismissing his public defender and insisting that the evidence was circumstantial, the photos artistic, and the list just notes for a writing project. At times, he referred to the victims by their initials only, reinforcing the chilling detachment that had defined his crimes. The prosecution countered by walking the jury through the timeline, each entry in the notebook matched to a death, each photograph paired with autopsy records, each receipt marked with dates of missing person reports. It was a brutal unraveling of Naso's constructed world. One of the most haunting moments of the trial came when the lead investigator read, aloud from a journal entry dated March 1992, "Girl 6. Came easy, pretty teeth, sunset glow, no mess." The courtroom was silent. That victim, later confirmed to be Tracy Tafoya, had been missing for nearly 20 years. Her body was found wrapped in a painter's tarp near a drainage ditch off Route 20. The phrase, "no mess," echoed long after the trial ended, not just because of its coldness, but because it captured Naso's entire ideology. Efficiency over chaos, control over carnage. This wasn't a man who lost himself in bloodlust. This was a man who refused to acknowledge the humanity of those he killed. To him, they were subjects, content for a twisted project that only he would ever see. He viewed murder not as destruction, but as design. And the longer authorities examined the evidence, the more they began to fear that his confirmed victims were just the surface of something deeper. The undeveloped rolls of film found in his home were sent for restoration. Many were degraded, but some revealed images never before seen by investigators. Women posed in motel rooms, their expressions neutral. the lighting poor, but the framing meticulous. Some were later identified, others weren't, and a few matched no missing persons reports at all, which raised a terrifying possibility. Joseph Naso had been operating for so long, so invisibly, that he may have killed women who were never missed, never filed, never found. They existed only in his photos, his notebooks, and in the dirt where he left them. The psychological profile by the FBI concluded that Naso exhibited traits of obsessive-compulsive disorder fused with narcissistic detachment. He didn't kill for pleasure in the traditional sense. He killed to fulfill an internal system, one that required balance, symmetry, and secrecy. He was not the type to escalate in frequency or brutality. Instead, he maintained the same clinical approach year after year, as if operating on a contract only he had signed. And that consistency, more than anything, is what made him so hard to detect. There were no peaks in violence, no major behavioral outbursts, just the hum of normal life, punctuated every few years by a disappearance, a discovery, a body left under power lines or near rural fence posts. In the end, even with a conviction and a sentence, the case of Joseph Naso remains unfinished because his list was incomplete, because his photos were endless, because the gaps between the killings still hide names the world doesn't know it lost, and because he never confessed, never clarified, never acknowledged what he did. He simply stopped when he was caught, not out of remorse, but out of inconvenience. With one more paragraph left to close his story, the question remains: how many names never made it into the notebook? The final chapter of Joseph Naso's story isn't found in a confession, a dramatic breakdown, or a final reckoning. It's found in the haunting silence he left behind. After his conviction and transfer to San Quentin State Prison, he became a ghost among the living, rarely speaking, never writing, his eyes vacant during visitor check-ins, his behavior robotic. There were no appeals filed with urgency, no cell block outbursts, no last-minute revelations. In fact, those who worked in the prison system said Naso's presence was so subdued, he almost seemed unaware he had been caught. He existed in the same closed loop he had always lived in, maintaining a quiet routine, exercising alone, eating in silence, and never discussing his case. But outside his prison cell, the damage he caused reverberated far beyond the courtroom verdict. Because what Naso stole from his victims wasn't just life, it was voice, memory, and identity. Many of the women in his photographs have still not been named. Some remain in cold case databases under placeholder tags: Jane Doe 37, Victim 04, unconfirmed, and each one represents a life that vanished without protest, a history that was reduced to an image in a storage box and a line in a killer's private ledger. Law enforcement continued to probe open leads, even years after his conviction, sending images to DNA swabs to labs, hoping to close the gap between file number and name, between photo and face. And in rare moments, those efforts paid off. A woman found in a shallow grave in Butte County in 1983, long believed to be a drifter, was finally identified in 2017 through familial DNA. Her name was Evelyn Marks. She had been missing since 1982. Her initials matched. Her image was in Naso's files. She had never made it into his notebook. That discovery was more chilling than vindicating. It confirmed what authorities feared most, that his notebook wasn't complete. It wasn't a full list. It was a partial index, a curated selection of deaths he chose to remember, while others were left off the page entirely. It meant that the number of women he had murdered could be far greater than 10, 20, 30, maybe more. Some killed before he started documenting, others after, some photographed but not named, others dumped without any record at all. The known kills were only the surface of a much deeper and darker history. Naso had used his obsession with structure to keep the world from seeing the whole. By organizing his victims into an alphabet, he had created a trap, one that distracted from the fact that chaos still lived between the letters. Victims like Evelyn weren't exceptions. They were proof of a broader, hidden system. And yet, for all the data collected, all the photos processed, all the hours of investigative work, Naso never offered clarity. He didn't contest the evidence, he didn't fight the death penalty, he didn't protest the charges, and most importantly, he never gave names, never admitted numbers, never confessed. In the few interviews granted during the years following his trial, he spoke only in evasive generality. "The media likes a good mystery," he said once when asked about the list. "But I like stories that never end." That line lingered with detectives for years because it echoed the very pattern he built. A trail of death designed never to resolve, never to conclude, only to loop back on itself like a riddle without a solution. And in that loop lived his legacy, not as a name whispered with infamy like Bundy or Dahmer, but as something more sinister, a quiet monster. A man who hunted with a pen and a camera, a killer who archived instead of confessed, documented instead of boasted. The Alphabet Killer wasn't flashy, didn't taunt police, didn't beg for attention. He kept his secrets buried and let time do the rest. And in that way, his story became something uniquely modern, a reflection of how a man could vanish into the systems he designed, blend into anonymity, and murder with a level of control that mocked the chaos most killers succumb to. His crimes weren't just executions. They were statements in a personal code that no one else could read. And even now, years later, the full cipher remains unsolved. For the families of his known victims, the scars remain open. Roxine Rogash's sister still keeps a copy of her yearbook photo taped to the refrigerator. Carmen Colan's childhood friend still lights a candle on her birthday, even though her real burial site was never confirmed. And the families of the unidentified women, the ones with only photos or circumstantial ties to Naso's movements, continue to wait for the day the phone rings with a positive match. In many ways, Joseph Naso's impact transcended his body count. He forced law enforcement to reassess the way they tracked serial patterns. He exposed the vulnerability of transient women in the criminal justice system. And he left behind an archive of horror that still has not been fully understood. Experts say that for every confirmed serial killer in the US, there are likely 3 more who remain unidentified. And Naso's case stands as a chilling reminder of how easily one of those 3 can live among us, pass for harmless, and carry out a methodical reign of terror hidden beneath layers of order and normalcy. He walked freely for decades, took photographs, labeled folders, cleaned up after himself, and never once confessed. In the end, it's not just what Joseph Naso did that terrifies, it's what he didn't do. He didn't rush. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't stop until someone opened a safe that wasn't supposed to be opened. And even then, he didn't speak, didn't explain. He let the list speak for him. But the list was incomplete, which means the story is too. Somewhere out there, another name still waits to be matched to a face. Another family still waits for closure. Another photo still sits undeveloped, faded, and curled in the dark. And the man responsible sits on death row, eyes open, mouth shut, a killer with no remorse and no need to be heard. Because for Joseph Naso, silence was always part of the plan. Some stories end in prison cells, others vanish into newspaper archives or courtroom transcripts that gather dust with time. But the stories in this compilation, of women drained of life by the hands of Donna Sue Gray, of flesh cataloged like trophies by Albert Fish Jr., of front doors turned death traps by Charles Severance, and of the alphabetized death diary left behind by Joseph Naso, these don't end with justice or answers. They end with residue that seeps into neighborhoods, that lingers in the minds of detectives years after they've retired, and that keeps the families of the dead wide awake in the middle of the night, staring at a ceiling that won't give them peace. What makes these cases more horrifying than fiction isn't the body count, it's the calm, the way they killed without chaos. the way they blended in, the way they created systems to keep their evil structured, quiet, and clean. There were no wild rampages, no erratic slips, just pattern, routine, method. They were shadows cast in daylight, monsters that didn't snarl. They smiled, they waited, they planned. They passed by people in grocery stores, stood in DMV lines, sat in church pews, and returned to crime scenes like nothing happened. That's what makes them unforgettable. Not because they were monsters, but because they looked so much like the rest of us. And what should chill us most isn't how much they got away with, but how long they did it before anyone even realized the pattern, before anyone noticed that the same kind of victim kept disappearing, or that the handwriting on 2 crime scene notes matched, or that the bodies kept turning up just outside county lines where jurisdictional confusion would delay response. And in that sliver of time, that crack in the system, they operated with near impunity, because evil doesn't always wear a mask or howl in the dark. Sometimes it carries a purse into a senior center and smiles before it kills. Sometimes it lives in a house with blinds and shelves full of photo boxes. Sometimes it sits in a courtroom and stares blankly as the prosecutor reads out the names of people it already forgot. These 5 killers didn't just take lives, they rewrote the rules of what a serial killer could be. They proved that the most dangerous predator isn't the one who announces themselves. It's the one who waits, watches, and strikes with such precise control that no one sees the terror until it's already too late. Their stories may be over, but their patterns, their cold logic, their meticulous planning, their obsession with invisibility live on in the systems they exploited. And for every killer we know, there may be 5 more walking free, waiting to see if their story will ever be told, or worse, hoping it never will.